Chapter 5. The Viking Raids and the Formation of England. In the last chapter we talked about the Anglo-Saxons, but discussing the people who settled in the area that would eventually become England as though they were one group can be misleading. The term Anglo-Saxons did not exist at this time. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the people living in England, although they did share many cultural similarities, would not have thought of themselves as a one people group. The 7 kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons were constantly fighting for power. At times, one kingdom, particularly Northumbria, Mercia and Wessex, emerged as the most powerful and required tribute from others, basically taking taxes. There was no consolidation or unity between the kingdoms. It would take a significant external threat to turn the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into England. Enter the Vikings. At the very end of the 8th century, the British Isles faced a new threat. Invaders from Scandinavia, known collectively as Vikings, began raiding. The earliest raids date to the 790s, but only increased over the next 100 years. And it's not hard to see why. A growing population in Scandinavia was looking for resources, and Britain was a prime target. The now Christian Anglo-Saxons had built many monasteries, furnished with much wealth, and inhabited by monks and nuns who would not fight back. They were easy and profitable targets for the Vikings, who had no religious qualms that would keep them from preying on these religious centres. You can imagine how much, or rather how little, resistance a group of armed Viking warriors met from monks. There was nothing to discourage the raids from continuing, and the fact that many of the monks persistently rebuilt after each devastating raid only meant that the Vikings never seemed to run out of targets. Of course, the great devastation caused by the Vikings was not simply because they picked easy targets. Even when attacking settlements with inhabitants who fought back, the Vikings were a deadly force. Their longboats were narrow, had shallow drafts, which allowed them to land directly on the beach near settlements. The Vikings could strike quickly before a village knew what was upon them, and then be back out to sea again before the victims knew what happened. As devastating as these raids were, especially for those living on the coast, we probably wouldn't be discussing them here if the Vikings had stopped at raiding. There must have been something appealing about the British Isles, because the Viking raiders turned into something far scarier: Viking settlers. Much like the Anglo-Saxons before them, around the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings began extending their time in England beyond the raiding season. They started to overwinter, spend the season when the seas were too rough for travel on the Isles, establishing settlements. With the establishment of settlements came larger conflicts with the Anglo-Saxons. Now it was not only coastal towns that had to fear the invaders. In 865, things went from bad to worse for the Anglo-Saxons. A large army of Vikings landed and soon began to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This huge force was aptly known as the Great Heathen Army. The name, which we get from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reveals a bias towards the invaders. So some historians refer to this force simply as the Great Army or Great Viking Army instead. All 3 names refer to the same group. Regardless of what you call it, the Great Army was undoubtedly effective. The Vikings conquered East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria with little trouble. Their influence and increasing power in Britain went relatively unchecked for the next decade. Alfred the Great and the rise of Wessex. After the initial success of the Great Army's invasion, the Vikings, having conquered 3 kingdoms with relative ease, had one last major Anglo-Saxon territory to defy them: Wessex. Wessex had faced Viking onslaughts during the early years after the landing of the Great Army. Their king was even killed in fighting in 871, leaving his brother Alfred, who was the 5th of 5 sons, as the new king of Wessex. For a while there was a reprieve in the fighting, but in 876 the Vikings renewed their efforts to conquer Wessex. In 878 the Vikings looked very close to victory. Their surprise attack on the Wessex fortress at Chippenham forced King Alfred to flee into the marshes of Somerset, with only a few of his men. Wessex was all but conquered. Letting King Alfred escape turned out to be a big mistake. While hiding in the marshes, Alfred and his men conducted a type of guerrilla warfare against the Vikings. Perhaps more importantly, though, Alfred was able to rebuild his forces. With his new army, Alfred marched against the Vikings later that year. The clash between the two forces took place at Edington, outside the fortress of Chippenham, which the Vikings had occupied after forcing Alfred to flee. Alfred's forces beat the Vikings, led by Jarl Guthrum at Edington, forcing the Vikings to flee back to Chippenham, where they surrendered to Alfred after a short siege. The terms of the treaty that followed were simple. Guthrum must be baptized as a Christian, and the Vikings must leave Wessex. Let's dive into both aspects further, because they tell us much about this time and what comes after in English history. First, why would Alfred require Guthrum to be baptized? In our modern world, it is hard for us to truly grasp how embedded religion was in every aspect of life in the Middle Ages. In fact, there are 2 mistakes we can make when thinking about religion in this day. One would be to assume that no one took their religion seriously. Religion, Christianity especially, was a huge part of medieval life because so many people believed. It would also be a mistake to think that religion never became a tool of politics or power. When an institution or belief system is so widespread that it melds into every aspect of life, people would try to use it for their own ends. With these 2 things in mind, we can perhaps better understand why Alfred would require Guthrum to be baptized, which was a clear sign of conversion to Christianity. To undergo baptism was a sign of political allegiance and a serious commitment. This does not necessarily mean that Guthrum had a change of heart and truly converted religions, but that he was at least committed to a public show of peace and, on some level, submission to Alfred. It was not an act that could be conveniently forgotten later. As a religious act, it was a more effective way of binding the peace agreement than a simple shaking of hands. When we consider that the other part of the peace agreement between Alfred and Guthrum, the baptism requirement only makes more sense. Alfred wanted the invading Vikings to leave Wessex, and he did not want them to return. The Vikings had been trying to conquer Wessex for around a decade, and a more permanent treaty was required for a more permanent peace. For Alfred, achieving that peace meant letting the Vikings have what they had already conquered. Alfred and Guthrum agreed to divide southeastern Britain. Alfred maintained control of Wessex and the smaller Anglo-Saxon kingdoms it dominated, including Kent. And Guthrum and his followers were given the area of East Anglia and parts of Mercia and Northumbria. To agree to let pagans have land conquered by Christians would have been very unsavoury, if prudent, decision. But by having Guthrum baptised, Alfred was in effect negotiating with a fellow Christian ruler. The area settled by Guthrum and his Vikings became known as the Danelaw, because it was under a Danish-style legal system. Since you may be confused at this point, let's take a quick moment to clarify some things. Although we refer to the great invading force that conquered the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and fought with Alfred as the Vikings, Alfred and his contemporaries referred to these people as the Danes. That's because the Vikings that invaded southern Britain were Danes. However, for the sake of correctness, we should also point out that not all Vikings are Danish. The Viking raiders that attacked other parts of the British Isles, such as Ireland and Scotland, were Norse. Vikings is a general term that refers to raiders from the Scandinavian countries of this period. Thanks to the Vikings, Wessex was now the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom on the island, and Alfred was the primary ruler, but England still did not exist. The Vikings still controlled huge parts of what had been Anglo-Saxon land. A lasting peace. If the peace agreement created by Guthrum and Alfred had lasted, England might not have formed. However, based on what happened next, we can assume neither party took the peace established after the Battle of Edington seriously, despite the baptism and the setting of boundaries. By 885, 7 years after the Battle of Edington, Alfred was again repelling Danes and Vikings from Kent. This invasion was supported by the Danes of East Anglia, Guthrum's people, and was a breach of the peace that had been established. Still, Alfred was not simply a victim of Viking warlust. The following year, Alfred captured London, an important strategic position between the Anglo-Saxon controlled area and the land controlled by the Danes. According to John Asser, a contemporary biographer who knew Alfred personally, this act of retaking London earned Alfred the acceptance of the other Anglo-Saxons as their king. However, we do not consider this the start of the Kingdom of England, for much of Anglo-Saxon territory remained under Danish rule. With the possession of London, Alfred may have intended to launch new assaults to drive the Danes from the island, but he never got the chance. He was forced to go on the defensive again, in 892 against Danish forces from the continent. By the time he died in 899, Alfred had made no more progress toward retaking the rest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. That was a task left up to Alfred's children. But before we move on to Alfred's children, we should spend more time talking about Alfred, because he is one of the few kings in history to have received the moniker The Great. As he is better known to history, Alfred the Great did far more than save the Anglo-Saxons from the Vikings. He was also a scholar and skilled administrator. Alfred worked to improve literacy rates in his kingdom and translated several prominent works into English to make their knowledge available to those who did not know Latin. He translated several works himself and had others translated in his name. This promotion of the English language also helped create a greater sense of a single English identity. As a ruler, Alfred was judicious. He was responsible for the creation of a law code that gave the Anglo-Saxons, who previously had many different laws and legal systems, a more united legal structure. While this might seem like a boring fact, the establishment of a single law code is vastly important. There could be no unified kingdom and thus no England without a single legal system. A king could not effectively rule an area with a dozen different sets of laws. Thus, although Alfred himself did not unite the Anglo-Saxons into the nation we know as England, the work he did in stopping the advance of the Danes and beginning to unify the Anglo-Saxons made the formation of England possible. The start of England. If Alfred the Great did not form England, who was the first king of England? It took the military and diplomatic work of Alfred's son and grandson to put Danelaw back under Anglo-Saxon control. In 729, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, became the first king to effectively rule all the Anglo-Saxon lands. This, however, was not the beginning of a long line of English kings passing the throne from father to son. While that might be how monarchy ideally functions, in the tumultuous Middle Ages it rarely went that smoothly. When Athelstan died in 939, he did not have a son, so the throne went to his half-brother, Edmund I. Then, shockingly, the Vikings invaded again. This time it was the Norse Vikings, not the Danes, based in Dublin, who attacked and seized control of Northumbria and raided the Midlands. Just like that, the unification of Anglo-Saxons that Athelstan had achieved was over. But this situation did not last long. By 944, Edmund I had regained control of the Midlands and Northumbria. A united Anglo-Saxon kingdom was restored, but things still weren't over. When Edmund I was killed by an outlaw in 949, his brother Edred took the throne, as Edmund's children were still too young to rule. Edred's reign witnessed rebellion from Northumbria, but he had firmly consolidated his control over the region before he died in 955. His successor was his nephew, Edwig, who became king at just 15 years old. Edwig was not a popular king. His poor handling of the church and other powerful members in his court led to both Mercia and Northumbria pledging their allegiance to his 14-year-old brother, Edgar, in 957. Edwig's support was so low that this arrangement was accepted, and the kingdom was effectively split, with Edgar ruling Mercia and Northumbria, and Edwig ruling Wessex and Kent. Once again, the unity of the Anglo-Saxons had been destroyed. This, too, only lasted a short while. King Edwig died 2 years later in 959, and Edgar became the sole ruler of the Anglo-Saxons. Within his reign, England began to see a more stable existence as a single kingdom. Edgar was the first king to officially be crowned in a coronation ceremony as the King of England. His coronation took place in his reign in 973 as a celebration of the stability England had experienced under him. It was not until later coronations began to take place at the beginning of the monarch's rule. A united kingdom. Thus, thanks largely to the Vikings, England came into existence. The external threat the Vikings presented forced England to unify in a way that nothing else could. And, although it had been a bit of a rocky start, the unification of the English that Alfred the Great started was well established by the time of Edgar's coronation in 973. Over the next century, this sense of collective identity grew stronger as the Wessex dynasty continued to rule. Common language, common laws, a common king, and even common local administration all worked together to create a common people. However, England would not always remain exclusively the land of the English. In 1066, another group arrived and brought some big changes. The Normans, which we will get onto in the next chapter.